Productive Disruption is a podcast presented by Rhodes Branding, spotlighting bold and innovative ideas that have the ability to reshape K-12 education. If you're looking for actionable ideas about how to operate and innovate your school, you've come to the right place. Let's get started.
Hello and welcome to Productive Disruption. My name is John Loveday. I'm the Vice President of Innovation and Growth at Rhodes Branding. Today, we are thrilled to have a very, very special guest with us, our first international guest, Daisy Christodoulou. Daisy is a former teacher, an assessment specialist, a researcher, an author. As a matter of fact, she's an award-winning educator. In 2019, she was given the New Year's Honors List from the members of the Order of the British Empire for her services to education. And Daisy, we are very honored and thrilled to have you join us today.
Great, yeah, I'm really glad to be here too, John. Looking forward to chatting with you.
Absolutely. Well, let's start with what motivated you to enter education in the first place. I know obviously you spent numerous years in your early days in your career as a teacher. So what motivated you to join this field?
So I'd always been interested in learning. I sort of, really loved learning when I was at school. So I always thought it would be something that I'd be interested in. Yeah, I think that was the big motivator for me. I did English literature as a degree subject, but I was kind of interested in lots of subjects really, and interested in lots of those. I taught literature and language at school, but actually I'd say the thing that I'm interested in lots of different subjects. I work a lot now with primary schools and with primary teachers, that's elementary teachers, I guess where you are, who teach lots of different subjects. And I'm just really interested in that learning process of how we come to understand something and come to know something new, whether that be learning a new language, learning a new kind of mathematics technique, reading a new book and understanding how that works. I'm just fascinated by the way our minds learn, and that stayed with me all the way through, and still with what I do now.
Lovely. So what was your experience like as a teacher? I know that it's been about a decade since you were in the classroom, but what was your overall experience like when you were a teacher?
So I trained to teach on a program called Teach First, which is very similar to Teach for America in the US. In fact, it was modeled on Teach for America. And I was one of the first cohorts to do Teach First. And the aim of Teach First, the point of it is you get placed into quite challenging schools, schools that have schools that are in maybe challenging areas of sort of economic disadvantage, what have you. And so I did go into a quite a challenging school, and a school that a term after I started, we have a school inspection body in the UK, and a term after I started, the school inspector said that this school was kind of in the lowest category of schools. It went into special measures, which means it needs kind of a lot of help to improve. So it was a bit of a baptism of fire to go into a school that was really struggling. So that side of it was quite tough, but it was incredibly rewarding. It was incredibly sort of fulfilling. Everyone says that about doing Teach First, that you have huge highs and huge lows, and that was certainly very true. But I do think, the feeling of being in a classroom where everything's going well and the kids are really learning is incredibly exciting and fulfilling. And in some ways, I certainly miss that today.
Yeah, it's interesting to think how much has changed the past couple of years, of course, with the global pandemic. And of course, 10 years ago feels more like 20 years ago for most of us. And so, if you were to transition back to the teaching profession, how do you think teaching in 2022 would be different than it was back in 2012?
So I think certainly in England, there's been a number of changes. I think that the structures of schools, they'd started to change when I was there, and they've really accelerated towards that. So a lot of schools now are in part of kind of more autonomous academy trusts that have a bit more autonomy from their kind of local governing body, their local authority. So that's been an interesting change. And it means that these groups of schools are kind of taking on more responsibility for training and professional development, And I think that's quite a good thing because it means that you have educators often who are experienced educators who are in charge of those really important functions and are much kind of closer to what's going on than perhaps people in local government might have been. So I think there's lots of positives around that. I think the other really interesting thing that's happened in England in the last 10 years is the debate about education has really shifted. And I think there's a real focus now, which there probably wasn't when I started to train, on the curriculum and on the importance of the curriculum. Whereas I think when I started to train, it was just the curriculum often was kind of taken for granted, and it was assumed other things were more important. It didn't really get a look in. Whereas I think now the inspection agency in England, but also just a lot of the discourse amongst school leaders, has come to realise that the content on the curriculum is really important, and that you can be doing a lot of things right, but if the content you're teaching perhaps isn't giving students what they need to succeed, then there's going to be a problem.
Yeah. Well, that's a great segue to our next question. I think you already partially addressed it. In the U.S., we've seen this shift, especially in the past 5 to 10 years, and perhaps longer, really shifting away from the macro model of schools. And you used to see all across the country, one or two schools in a community that sometimes had thousands of students in them. And now we're shifting more towards a micro model where whether it's a private school, a public charter school, a traditional public school, but a lot of times they're smaller, and they have a very specific niche. They may be a STEM school or a school that's focused on the arts or a school that really dives heavily into hands-on learning. And so I'm curious, have you seen that in the UK? And do you think there's any similarities to what's happening here in America with that macro micro model shift?
So I think there definitely has, not just the last 10 years, but probably the last sort of 15, 20 years, been an explosion of kind of school types in England. I think that's really true. And when I say school types, I mean the sort of different governance structures, different funding structures, and yes, certainly as well, kind of to what extent they will sort of specialise in certain ways. So I think there are a real number of different types of schools in England. There's been an experiment with schools that start at age 14, university technical colleges. So there are all these different kind of experiments playing out in the system. I think the real challenge for all schools, and it sounds like it's similar to what you were saying there, is how you trade off kind of the need to specialise with the need to provide everyone with a broad base of education. And I think that's really hard, and it gets into difficulties about financing models as well. So I know from a lot of the schools I've worked with, a lot of them will want to. So in England, we tend to have 11 to 16 schools for 11 to 16-year-olds, secondary schools. And then historically, some schools have had a sixth form. So their sixth form would be ages 17 and 18, and some schools haven't. And what you're seeing happening now is a lot of schools would like to have a sixth form. So they'd like to extend their education they offer up to 18, not just finish at 16. But the great challenge they have is that after the age of 16, a lot of students want to specialise a bit more. And then the great challenge is how can you accommodate all of the potential options that the students would want to do in just one sort of ordinary size school. So that's a huge challenge too. How do you make that work? So how do you provide a kind of general, really good education in the basics for all students? How do you also provide the specialist courses that some of them might want? And how do you make sure that all students maybe have access to those? I think that is really difficult. It's difficult enough in a big city. So in a big city, often you can have students who can travel a bit more, so they can move between maybe different campuses. As you say, one of the advantages of size of having a really big school is that they'll be able to do that specialisation, that they can, guarantee having viable class sizes for a range of subjects. But the trade-off there, as I'm sure you see in the US too, is that often very big schools have other downsides. So very big schools can be perhaps quite intimidating, particularly for younger students. Students can get a bit lost in them. So there are all these difficulties. And I think finding kind of the optimum size for a school where it's small enough for everyone to feel like they belong, but it's big enough to provide some sort of specialisation, I think that's definitely a challenge that a lot of schools are grappling with.
Yeah. As recently as last year, when I was still on the other side of the table, when I was still in the school sector, our school was one of the first in the Southeast to really expand the number of school days. And so typically, of course, in America, 180 school days is average. And, we were one of the first to really expand that to 200 plus, 210, 220. And, it was an interesting process because really no one had tried that. And any additional time beyond the 180 days, it was considered summer school, which for a lot of parents, that's punitive, or a lot of students, that's punitive. You failed a grade, you failed a class, so now you must go to school during the summer to make it up, right? And I think we started to see that shift and that mindset change. But it's always fascinating to me because if you look at a lot of other industrial countries, you look in countries in Europe or Asia, or really anywhere across the world, many of them are structured to where their kids are in school more than 180 days. And if you expand that from primary school all the way to college, kids are getting in other places across the world, they're getting multiple years more instruction than they do get in America. And so, do you guys have you seen any change as far as the number of school days, how the school year is structured? Has that conversation come up in the UK as well?
Yeah, definitely. So it tends to come up sort of periodically. Every few years, someone will say, "Well, why would?" So in England, we have 6 week summer holidays. So we have a summer holiday that runs from kind of mid July to the end of August. So you have those
Yep.
6 weeks off. And then there's this idea, well, that only we only have those 6 weeks because when schools were set up, we had to let the kids go to help the harvest. Why are we still
Mhm.
setting up a school calendar based
That's right.
on that kind of process? So you do periodically get these kind of talks about that. The other thing people often say is having a big break in the summer is bad for learning
Mhm.
because students forget a lot. So there's other people who say, well, maybe we could keep the school holidays the same length, but we should split them up so there's not this big 6 weeks in the summer
Mhm.
because those 6 weeks students forget a lot, and there's a lot of evidence to show that they do forget a lot, and summer learning loss is an issue. So
Mhm.
yeah, these debates do come up again and again, and they've come up again, I think, with a vengeance after COVID, where people have been saying, well, students have lost all this time. Shouldn't we be able to make up some of that time as well?
That's right.
There's been a lot of talk as well about tutoring and catch up. So, can we have a tutoring program so that students can catch up what they've missed? I think the real challenge with all of these things for me, and the sort of line I tend to take on it, is if you want to expand the school day or add tutoring, you're essentially extending kind of capacity.
Mhm.
And for me, I would say you have to make sure before you extend capacity that you're doing the most with the capacity you already have. You're doing the most with the resources you already have. And so my focus would always be on trying to make the current school structures and the current school day to make those as efficient and working as well as possible before you start adding more resource in. Because I think there's a risk that you start adding in resource. So and a lot of evidence has shown as well that when you have situations where you maybe increase the number of teaching hours or you increase the number of teachers in a system, that if those teachers aren't as well trained or as good as the teacher existing in the system, that can be an issue too, that you're overall kind of
Yep.
reducing the quality. So I think you do have to be careful if you want to expand the amount of time in school, that you've got mechanisms to make sure that that time is going to be effective and that time is going to
Yep.
be kind of well used. And I think that's the struggle people are having in England at the minute, where they are trying to introduce a lot more tutoring and catch up programs, but are trying to keep the quality of it high as well. That's the challenge.
That's right. Yeah, we refer to the summer in America as the brain drain. I think when kids
Yeah, yeah,
are able to turn it off for six,
yeah.
8 weeks, even if they're in a parent family structure, to where they're still reading at night and they're still engaged and they're still being challenged. It's amazing what they do forget. And obviously, we probably could have a whole different podcast just talking about the impact of COVID on education and where kids are now versus where they would have been if there wasn't a global pandemic the past 2 years. So it's fascinating, and we're going to lean on experts like you to help us understand how to get kids back to where they need to be. And I think frankly, it's going to take years. It's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take a long time to get kids to where they need to be. But I want to shift gears for a moment, and you spent 4 years working at the ARC schools. So tell our listeners what are the ARC schools? What was your role there, and what was your overall experience like?
Yeah, so ARC Schools, it's based in London, and it's called a multi-academy trust. So it's probably the closest analogy I can think of is maybe what in the US you would have as a charter management organisation. So essentially, a group of, in England they're called academy schools, which are schools that are kind of a bit more remote from a kind of local government control. So they're still you would call them public schools. We call them state schools. So they're still government funded schools. They're government schools and they're government funded, but they have a little bit more autonomy from government.
Yeah.
And we call those academies. And when you have a group of those academies come together and work together, it's called a multi-academy trust. So our school is a multi-academy trust, and I worked in the central office, and I worked on research and assessment and curriculum, and did a lot of work on assessment and on setting up the assessment policies across all of the schools. So that was a really fascinating job, working with about 40 schools, a mixture of you would say elementary and high schools, and yeah, absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, that sounds just like a charter school structure in the U.S.
Yeah.
And what we have seen definitely the past 2 years, in particular during COVID, is charter schools really have exploded in growth locally here in South Carolina, but really across the U.S. And there's lots of reasons for that. One particular reason is a lot of charter schools remained open physically during COVID, or they were only remote and online for shorter periods, and so
Mhm.
it was fascinating to see that growth. And I think that once you kind of open Pandora's box, for lack of a better term, I think parents have been exposed to what those options provide. It will be fascinating to see if there is a shift back to the more traditional public school models, or if these charter schools or academies, they continue to have the interest that they do right now. Was there any particular initiative or any project or anything that was, a rewarding experience while you were at the art schools that really stands out to you?
Yeah. So one of the big things I worked on was writing assessment. As I say, I used to be an English teacher. And one of the big things we worked on was we would share. So students across all of the different schools would sit similar assessments, or the same assessment. And then the teachers, we would come together at the centre and we'd work together on moderating that writing, agreeing the marks for it. And that was a really fascinating process because it was great to see responses from different students from all of these different schools, often in many different parts of England. That was very rewarding, and to talk to all the different teachers who had taught those. So that was really rewarding, and that came off the back as well of you can only kind of do those common assessments when you have a common curriculum. So that was getting that in place and knowing that all these students, as I say, in different schools were studying the same thing and having teachers come together and discuss it was fascinating. And then the writing assessment, the moderation process, it was great in one way in that we got to come together and share all of this work from lots of different students. But in another way, was also uh, made me realise there were big problems in the way that we moderate writing. And actually, that was the catalyst for my next role, which was to go and work for a company who worked much more specifically on this. So, yeah, I would say the work I did on assessment and on writing assessment and sort of common assessments across the schools was probably the most rewarding, and also the one that led me to my current career.
Yeah. Before we transition to your current career, I have one final question. I'm curious, in America, folks that support charter schools or academies, one of the main reasons why there is support is there's a mindset that charter schools are disrupting traditional public schools. They're innovating. They're forcing traditional school settings to think outside the box, and they're seeing the shift of students to a lot of charter schools, and so they're having to self-reflect and improve. Maybe people that are not as supportive of charter schools see it as a drain of resources. So we're sending public funds to charter schools, and they're concerned about resources and teachers and students shifting and so forth. Um, and I'm a big believer the truth is always somewhere in the middle, typically in life. But I'm curious, do you have you seen a similar reaction to academies like the ARC schools in London? And is that conversation happening across the pond?
That's really interesting. And I think what's also really interesting, I said that Teach First was set up sort of copying Teach for America. Academy schools actually were kind of set up as a bit of a copy of charter schools in the US. And many of the most famous academies in England, the founders explicitly kind of went to America and saw some of the famous American charter schools and were inspired by them, including a very famous one at ARC, King Solomon Academy, which was one of the first ARC Academy schools. And the founders there were, I think, very much inspired by KIPP and went to America and saw those KIPP schools. So I think the American charter school movement has had a big influence on the UK academy movement, and I think there are some similarities. What I would say though is, and I don't mean this to sort of try and be negative or whatever, but I think what initially when academies started up, there were those kind of concerns you're talking about, like are they just going to be a drain on the public sector resources? Are they just going to kind of cherry pick students? Are they going to be kind of all those problems? And I think that those concerns were quite prominent, in the first years of them setting up. What's happened now is actually the government have given most schools the chance to become academies. So they've actually, the difference now with the English movement compared to the American one is certainly in the case of high schools, most schools are now academies. And so kind of a lot of the heat's gone out of the debate because most schools now are. And so the debate now is not really about whether academy schools are kind of a drain on resources. I guess the debate is just generally over resources for all schools. And also the debate's about how you, ways you need to do accountability in this new world. So in the old days, schools kind of were attached to their local authority. And now more and more of them aren't. They're attached to these multi-academy trusts. And now the big debate is around, well, what kind of accountability should these multi-academy trusts have? And if a school is failing within a multi-academy trust, like should it be able to be removed from one trust and placed into another trust? So a lot of the debates in England at the minute are kind of at that level. They're probably less about that, because certainly in London, where I live, which is where it was a real pioneer of the academy movement, I think, definitely most schools in London now are academies. So it's not like a parent would be looking at academy and looking at a local authority school and saying, which one's right for my student. It would be that kind of most of them now are academies. And I think I think that it's kind of has really shifted. But there certainly were those debates you were talking about. And I think certainly early on in the academy movement, there was that issue. And you will still hear this now, that perhaps some of the most famous and successful academies, people will say, oh, they only get those good results because they cherry pick. They're not taking on kind of their fair share of students. And those things are very controversial, and you will certainly still hear those. I like you, I tend to think, the truth is maybe somewhere in the middle. I think there probably are some practices with some of those academies which weren't ideal around kind of student entrance. But I think, to tie all academies with that brush would be unfair. And there are lots of them who are doing a fantastic job in incredibly difficult circumstances as well.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Well, thank you for sharing that. And I think that's a good segue to what you're doing now. So when you moved away from the art schools and the academies in the London area, you started working with an ed tech company that is known as No More Marking. And so I'm curious to know, first, what is No More Marking, and what motivated that transition to that new sector?
Yeah, so No More Marking, we are a small edtech company, and we have a different way of assessing students' writing. And what motivated me to do it is what I was talking about earlier, those issues I'd found previously when I was teaching, of the challenges of assessing students' writing accurately. So I found that it was really difficult, that it was really hard to get teachers to agree. So if you imagine you've got an essay written by a student, if I'd photocopy that essay 10 times, give it to 10 different teachers, I'd give them all the rubric to mark it with, often I'd get 10 different responses, 10 different grades they'd be giving it. And so it was really hard to get people to agree. And the more I dug into this, the more I researched it, the more I realised this wasn't just a problem we had. It was a problem that was true kind of everywhere. It was true globally, that it's really hard to assess writing accurately. And that was when I came across No More Marking. So No More Marking was set up by sort of the two co-founders had sort of met whilst working for an assessment organisation. And they too had kind of realised this problem, coming at it from a different angle. And they'd come across this technique called comparative judgment. And comparative judgment is basically a more reliable and a more accurate way of grading students' writing. So how it works is like this. As I've said, with traditional assessment, you look at one piece of writing and you look at the rubric and you're marking the piece of writing against the rubric. With comparative judgment, you have two pieces of writing. You'll scan all your pieces of writing into our system, and then you'll have two pieces of writing appear on the screen at the same time. And you'll read them both, and you'll say to yourself, which is the better piece of writing? Is it the one on the left or the one on the right? And you don't just make one decision like that, you'll make a series of decisions like that. And your colleagues will join in, and they will also make a series of decisions like that. And then when we've got enough decisions, we combine them all together, and we use all of them to come up with a measurement scale for every piece of writing. Now, I realise that sounds a bit abstract. It sounds a bit weird. Like, why would you want to do it like that? But the amazing thing is that this approach gives you so much better agreement. And the reason for that is that the human mind, we find absolute judgments really hard. So if you just give people one piece of writing and tell them to mark it, that's hard. If you just ask people to look at one thing and tell me how tall that thing is, that's hard. But if you give them two things and say, like, which is better or which is taller, it's much, much easier. And I hope you can see that just yourself. Like, if one person walks into the room you're in now and I say, how tall are they? That's quite hard. If two people walk in and I say, who's taller? Person on the left, person on the right. It's much, much easier. So comparative judgment works on that basis, on the idea that comparative judgments are much simpler and easier for the human mind to process than absolute judgments. And that's what we do with students' writing. And we get reliability rates that are far, far in excess of what's achieved by the big exam boards in England. And we work with about 2,500 schools in England on this approach. We also work with a couple of hundred schools in the US and with some schools in Australia too. So we've currently got projects in the UK, the US, and Australia.
That's fascinating. You know, as a former history teacher, I remember sitting down many, many times and grading or marking so many writing assessments and research papers and different things. And
Yeah.
even just the human factor of if you're sitting down and it's been a long day and you're
Mhm.
tired, as the evening goes on, your assessment of these writing samples may not be as fair. And so there's so many factors, I think, when it goes into assessments and grading or marking these assessments. And I wish I would have had comparative judgment back when I was still in the classroom. That's so fascinating. You mentioned a couple of partners or several hundred partners in the U.S. Has there been one or two that stood out to you that you really enjoyed working with, and how did those teachers here in America, how did they adopt comparative judgment to their classroom?
Yeah. Yeah, so I was just say that anecdote of you marking the piece of writing and knowing that as you get more tired, as the night goes on, your judgments are likely to shift. That's absolutely true, and that's true for all of us because we're humans, and those kinds of sort of issues creep in. And with comparative judgment, it still involves human judgment. But one of the other great things about comparative judgment is that every piece of writing is seen 20 times. So obviously, anything involving human judgment, there can be a bit of human error. But with comparative judgment, we reduce the possibility of error because the comparative judgment is simpler than the absolute judgment. And then also because we get so many judgments, if there are any road judgments, they wash out, they cancel out. So that example of you marking those sort of scripts when you were a history teacher, that's absolutely the experience I had as well as an English teacher, of marking pieces and getting more tired and thinking, gosh, am I really as reliable at the end of the evening as I was at the start? That's absolutely true. And that's the kind of thing comparative judgment addresses. So then, just to say about the US context and who we work with in the US, one of our most exciting partnerships in the US is with an organisation called the Writing Revolution. They're based in New York City, and they provide professional development for writing based on the Hockman method. Judith Hockman, their founder, she's developed this method of teaching writing. It was written up in a really popular article in The Atlantic, I think in 2012, called The Writing Revolution. And that's where they get the name of their company, their organisation, and their book. Their book called The Writing Revolution is very popular. So they're a really amazing, as I say, New York City-based organisation, and we work with them. I'm really delighted to work with them because they really kind of match up with what we think about assessment too, what we think about pedagogy and curriculum and teaching. So they have this amazing way of teaching writing, and we work with them on their assessments. So we provide their assessments for them using comparative judgment. So that's a really nice partnership we have with them. We work with other schools in the US as well. And if any school in the US would like to take part in our US project, they can do so. Go to nomoremarking.com and look for Assessing America's Writing under our project page. And that will tell you all the information about how you can take part in our American project. And not only that, that's a paid for project. But if you would just like to try out comparative judgment, just informally, just to see how it works, our website's free to use for in-school, kind of non-commercial use. So if any school out there is hearing this, you're in the US and you just want to have a play with this, how does this work? Go to our website, set up a free account. You can judge some writing from your own school for free. You can either do that, judge some writing from your own school for free to get a flavour of how it works, or you can pay to take part in our bigger American project, which involves a task that we set that all schools, lots of schools from across America take part in at the same time.
Incredible. I mentioned in the introduction that you're multi-talented. You do lots of things, and one of those things is you're an author. And it looks like one of your more recent books that was published in 2020 is titled "Teachers versus Tech: The Case for an Ed Tech Revolution." And so I was fascinated by that, of course, because what we do here at Rhodes Branding is very, very focused on productive disruption. We want schools to innovate and to think outside the box and to be out of their comfort zone and to grow and to improve. We really don't care if you're a traditional public or a public charter or a private. We believe that with rising tides, all boats rise. And so I'm curious, when did you start writing this book? Well, I assume it was probably before the pandemic. And how did perhaps the pandemic impact how you wrote this book and how this book came to a result?
Absolutely, yeah. So I started writing the book, you're right, in about sort of 2018, 2019, I wrote the bulk of it. And it came out in early 2020. And it came out, I think, the book launch actually got cancelled because of the pandemic. So it came out just a week or two kind of before the pandemic really hit. So either sort of very good or very bad timing, depending on what you think.
Yeah.
So yeah, I did write the bulk of it before the pandemic. I'd like to think that a lot of it stands up after it. So what I was kind of writing about were effective and less effective uses of EdTech. What does work, what doesn't. And so I was looking at lots of different programs that are out there and also trying to look at some general principles for where technology could help. And my sort of, one of my biggest principles is to try and get the technology to do things that humans are bad at. So generally things that involve crunching large sets of data in quick time, those kinds of things are things that humans are not as good at as computers. So try and get computers to do those. And then, have the humans where they are going to add the most value. I do think, and I think actually we have seen this with the pandemic, that it is pretty hard to take all of teaching and schooling online. So you can obviously do some things around that. And there's been some more interesting innovations, obviously, since then. And there's certainly been some things that have really added value for students who struggle to travel, who are in remote places. But I think what we've also learned is that there is still a value in some element of human and personal contact too. So that's been interesting.
Yeah. The majority of my career in education was in the online sector. And I've said many, many, many times that, virtual or online education was never meant to be a one size fit all. It was never meant to replace in-person instruction. It was meant to supplement. And it is a fantastic fit for many kids, but not all. And I think we learned over the past 2 years that there are certainly families and children and young people that thrive online. But there are many that need the face-to-face online instruction in order to really meet their potential. And the reality is, what we experienced during COVID was really emergency, um, you know, uh, instruction and pedagogy. It really wasn't. We didn't have time to sit back and really build out the platforms for every school, for every child to learn online. It was literally we flipped the switch essentially, right? And it really came quickly. And so I really always reinforce with folks that if you were in a school setting where online learning perhaps didn't work well, understand that perhaps it wasn't. It was simply by design, or sometimes lack thereof. And if you really have an online system that is built thoughtfully and strategically over a long period of time, and you find the right students that actually fit that model well, it can work, and it can work very, very well. And so, there's a difference between, again, the emergency online system that COVID forced versus actual legacy, structured online learning. So it really is a fascinating topic. But I have two final questions for you, Daisy. First, where do you see education headed, both locally in the UK, but perhaps more broadly and globally the next 5 or 10 years? Do you see some shift? Do you see kind of where we are now? Are we going to stay on this trajectory, or do you think we'll have some shifts in the next decade?
Yeah, so I think things are sort of different in different countries, but one of the things that I think certainly happened in England in the last 10 years is, as I say, there's been a real focus on the importance of the curriculum and the idea that not all curriculums are created equal. And also, there's been a real focus on evidence and evidence based teaching. So, looking more to evidence about how the mind works, evidence about how we learn. And I think that's made a big change in that. And I think those are two things I see happening globally as well. And I think they'll continue. So if I just take those two things sort of separately, the research, if you like, on cognition, I think why that's really important is I think education has had a tendency in the past to succumb to kind of maybe pseudoscience and fads. And I think one of the ones that I often talk about in a lot of my writing that's quite prominent is learning styles. So learning styles have are a really popular idea. They have a really big following. You'll see lots of schools will say to students, what's your learning style? You need to find out what your learning style is so you can learn in the best way for you. And yet all of the research shows that there's no such thing. There's been lots and lots of tests on do learning styles kind of really make a difference? Do people have learning styles? And all the evidence shows no, that we have learning preferences, but we don't learn better when learning is tailored to those preferences. We learn better when learning is tailored actually to the ideal kind of modality for the content being studied. So, certain content will lend itself to certain types of learning. So, for example, if you would like to learn all of the countries in Africa and where they are on a map, that lends itself to something that's a visual thing to learn. To try and convert that into something for an auditory learner kind of just doesn't make sense. It's something you have to learn visually. So things like learning styles, I think, are a great example of how education often can succumb to some of these fads and gimmicks. And what I've seen happening in the last 10 years, I would say, is there's more of a trend for people to be a bit more critical, to use research a bit more, and there's a bit more research in the profession, and for people to start to apply some of that a bit more. So I think that's a huge trend, and I think that will continue, and I think it's great that that's going to continue. So I think that's a big one for both countries. And then, as I've said about the curriculum as well, of that, knowing what's on the curriculum, and it kind of in a sense ties with what I was saying about the learning styles point, that it really matters the content you're teaching, and the content you're teaching, that will make a difference as to the assessments you pick and the pedagogy you pick. That really matters, and you can't just kind of swap in and out different content and assume it's kind of interchangeable. That matters as well. So I think those are two big trends, which I think not just the UK, not just the US, but globally will be big trends.
Absolutely. Well, we end every podcast by asking each guest this question, and it's a fun one. You can take this wherever you would like, but we're going to hand you the magic wand,
Yeah,
and you can change anything in K-12
yeah,
education, whether it's locally or globally,
yeah.
and we want to know what you're going to change and why.
Wow, great question. So I've talked a bit about how I think education is a little bit susceptible to pseudoscience, and I've talked a bit about some of the kind of the things like learning styles that I've said are an issue, and that maybe in the past the content in the curriculum hasn't been privileged as much. So I would say I would really like to see every teacher training institution in the world that there's a unit in it on cognitive psychology. So there's a unit in it on how the brain works, how the brain learns, the importance of curriculum knowledge, the importance of long-term memory, all those kinds of things. I think those are really important, and they are often not taught about or talked about enough. So I'd love to see a unit in every teacher training course that would focus on those.
Wonderful. Well, again, Daisy, thank you for helping us make history today as our first international guest on this
Great.
podcast. We are
Brilliant.
just so thrilled and again, honored to have someone with such experience, and an award-winning educator to join us on this podcast. So if you want to learn more again about Daisy's work, please visit knowmoremarking.com. You can learn a lot more about comparative judgment. You can find lots of great resources, and I would encourage all of our viewers to visit your website. So Daisy Christodoulou, we appreciate you so much for your time, your expertise. Thank you for joining Productive Disruption.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, John. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you.